Troy Jackson is now the Democratic nominee for the Senate race in Maine. He just received 566 delegate votes at the convention in Bangor. His opponent, Sandra Pelletier, received only 5. Troy Jackson is a fifth-generation logger, and he is the former president of Maine's state Senate. And before this week, he did not have much name recognition at all outside of the state. There was a University of New Hampshire poll taken before Jackson secured the nomination. It found that he has a slight lead now over incumbent Republican Susan Collins in a hypothetical matchup in November. It is an early indication that this race may be even more competitive than expected. Collins is pursuing her 6th term as senator and has spent decades cultivating an image of being an independent Republican, somebody who's willing to buck her own party when necessary, but that does not necessarily line up with her votes. She has voted with Donald Trump more times than not when it really matters. And you know what? Voters in Maine are picking up on that. I spoke to some folks, even here in New York, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan a couple weeks ago. Here's one of them. Here's what one of them said about Susan Collins.
She has a habit of, quote, being very concerned.
Concerned, always. Susan Collins is always concerned
about certain issues. And then she ends up voting 90% of the time
with Trump.
With Trump, yeah.
Yeah, that's her line, right? Like, I'm concerned.
Yeah. So at the point where I know what somebody's going to say and what somebody's going to do, I can judge that against whomever is a possible candidate.
And that is an exact line that Troy Jackson used in his speech today. Susan Collins has survived election after election despite that concern, even as Maine has grown increasingly blue in presidential races. And, while being politically experienced is not usually viewed as a bad thing, new polling shows that a lot of Americans are craving change. There's a Fox News poll. It found that more than 80% of registered voters say they want some level of change in government. That is the kind of political climate that makes even seasoned incumbents like Susan Collins pay attention, if not freak out. Incumbents don't just run against challengers. They run against their own record. And more importantly, they run against the mood of the country. And you guys know what that is. Economic concerns and the war with Iran. All this stuff is top of mind for voters right now. And it is creating this enormous pressure for Republicans and for President Trump. And Republicans like Susan Collins have to walk a very delicate line at this point of supporting the president while also appeasing her own voters who are struggling to put food on the table all across Maine. And there's even more polling that suggests Democrats might now have the edge. Check this out. Emerson College. It's a survey of likely 2026 voters. It finds that Democrats have an 11-point advantage over Republicans on the generic congressional ballot. And that is why a state with less than 2 million residents is suddenly one of the most closely watched battlegrounds in all of America. The great Chris Jansing, MS Now's chief political reporter, remains in Maine and is watching this for us up close in Bangor. Chris, it's an exciting day in Maine.
Unbelievable. And you know what I was watching? I was watching the mood of the people as they left. And I saw virtually everyone smiling, virtually everyone deep in conversation. And you just missed it, Jacob. There was a group of union members who were singing a union song there. And I've talked about the fact that the ground game that they provide will be critical to this. But look, there was one Democrat close to Troy Jackson who said to me that what he's been through is somewhere between a high wire act and a moon landing in terms of challenges. There's a huge challenge ahead, but in many decades of covering politics, there's 2 things I always look for. One is know your audience. And if you listen to that speech Troy Jackson gave, he definitely knows who his audience is. He said, people like us, we're not supposed to have power. That resonates in such a profound way in parts of the state that are struggling, and anyone who knows people and understands people are struggling. Let me play just a little more of the point he made that really speaks, I think, to what I'm hearing from Mainers. Take a listen.
Working people, despite all of our challenges, are not powerless. We're only made to feel powerless when we stand alone. And that is what they try and do, is divide us. And that's why I entered public life. Fought for working people in the legislature and in the Maine Senate. And it's why I'm running for the United States Senate today.
And he said to the people in this audience watching on TV and here in this room, if you have been ignored, if you have been underestimated, join our campaign. I think there's a second thing that a lot of people have been watching for, because he's coming in to succeed someone late in the game who is believed to have extraordinary political gifts. But some people can rise to the occasion. It's what folks are looking for. He gave a strong speech. He gave a speech that did what he needed it to do, which was to get these folks fired up. And I think he also spoke very strongly to the moment we're in. He talked about reproductive rights. He talked about giving people a fair shake. He talked about concerns about billionaires coming in and making decisions for people who are doing the hard work. And he talked a little bit about his own history in fighting for equality for every working person in Maine, and how his time as a logger really informed the rest of the way he has gotten involved in politics. Now, he has not always been successful in politics. He has not always been a prolific fundraiser. And those are things that his campaign is very aware of, and that the
inclusive and transparent for both delegates to get involved, which every single Maine Democrat did, including, of course, Graham Plattner voters, who are an important part of our party and our base, as well as candidates who stepped up to meet this moment as well.
So, Devin, if Democrats are going to be successful in winning this race, they've got to make the race a referendum on Susan Collins and quite frankly, her embrace of Donald Trump and how that embrace has enabled all of his agendas. So can you talk a little bit about what we expect to hear from your nominee from this seat, particularly as it relates to the women voters, the undecided female voters that Jackie just mentioned? And I also want to highlight a point that Eugene Daniels said just last week about, yes, you are the head of the Democratic Party, the executive director of the Democratic Party there, but independents make up such a huge part of the electorate there. Can you talk a little bit about how you're planning to reach those voters as well?
Absolutely. Let's take this in two parts. So the first part is that Susan Collins has voted with Donald Trump 96% of the time. That's a fact. That's not up for debate, right? She can tell us one thing, but we know that her record speaks for itself. So yes, this is a referendum on Susan Collins betraying the Maine people. She even went on national TV and tried to lie to the American people about the vote count for Kavanaugh very recently. We know that she is attempting to utilize the political charade that she has done for the past 30 years, which is say one thing and do another. And something I can tell you about Mainers is we like to walk the walk. And so we're going to hold her to account for saying one thing and doing another, and we're going to let her record speak for itself. It is our job at the Maine Democratic Party to ensure that every single Maine voter has that fact before they cast their ballot in November. Now to the second piece about independents. We do know that about 60% of unenrolled voters, which is what we call independents here in Maine, voted for Susan Collins in 2020. We know that we also need to win those independent voters. How we do that is by holding Susan Collins' feet to the fire and ask her to respond to her record. We are already doing that. We're seeing the success of that campaign by watching her poll numbers dip the lowest that they've ever been in 30 years. Susan Collins is scared, and she should be, because we are coming for her in November. And if there's anything as a testament that the viewers can see right now, it's behind me, all these folks that are here and engaged in this process and ready to have eyes on the ball. We're going to have a nominee that's going to come out of this in the next few hours, and then we will be absolutely off to the races running to defeat her on November 3rd.
And Devin, before we are out of time, I just want to circle back to my first question, because for viewers who are watching today and trying to learn a little bit more about these candidates, I'm wondering again if you can spell out for us what is Troy Jackson's position on abortion and what is Sandra Pelletier's position on abortion, because this does seem to be at its core one of the biggest issues for Maine voters when it comes to trying to build that case against Susan Collins.
Well, look, what I would encourage everybody to do is to go to the campaign websites for each of these candidates. Both of those websites exist. Additionally, on our website, mainedems.org, we do have a voter guide where folks can learn more about the candidates. I will let those folks speak for themselves. Again, our dedication as the Maine Democratic Party was to give those candidates the platform to communicate their policy issues and where they stand on policies like abortion and bringing down the cost of living, which will be the #1 issue in this election. election here in Maine to voters directly. And I feel very proud that we were able to do that. We required candidates to go out and collect 500 signatures from across the state. And something that I thought was really interesting that we were able to put forth is that we required, of those 500 signatures, at least 50 to come from 8 of our 16 counties, which really forced our candidates to build a volunteer corps, which is going to be necessary to beat Susan Collins, and to get out and to talk to voters in every single part of the state, so that when they're thinking about the policy issues and they're rolling out their policy platforms, that they have the voices of real everyday Maine voters in their ears, and they are connected with their pulse, right, that of what we have going on the ground and what matters to us Mainers the most.
Executive Director of the Maine Democratic Party, Devin Murphy Anderson, on a very busy morning. And I will say,
And here is the truly delicious irony in all of this. The very scandal Republicans thought would save Donald Trump and Susan Collins may now be the thing that helps sink both of them. You really could not script this any better. Everybody was talking about the Plattner scandal, and frankly, they should have been. The allegations were ugly, the political baggage was enormous, and getting that candidate out of the race was probably the best possible outcome for Democrats. He was a liability, and keeping him around would have handed Susan Collins months of free ammunition. But notice what Republicans were not talking about. They were not talking about Susan Collins' record. They were not talking about the cost of living, Trump's agenda, the war, healthcare, reproductive rights, or what Collins has actually delivered for working families in Maine. Instead, they wanted the entire election to revolve around somebody else's personal life, marriages, relationships, departures, and a collection of scandals that were politically explosive but completely unrelated to any positive Republican vision for the state. And that is because Republicans have almost nothing positive to run on in Maine. Maybe that strategy works in a deep red state where a large part of the electorate genuinely supports Trump's most extreme policies. Maybe there are voters there who look at the chaos, cruelty, and nonstop dysfunction and say, yes, give us more of that. But Maine is not that kind of state. Susan Collins cannot win by openly defending what Susan Collins has actually done. She has to pretend she is some completely different senator, or she has to distract voters by making the entire campaign about the failures and scandals of somebody else. Now, to be clear, those scandals were legitimate. They deserved scrutiny. But they were also the only real weapon Collins and the Republicans had. And by using that weapon so aggressively, they accidentally did Democrats a favor. They helped force a damaged candidate out of the race and cleared the way for someone who appears to be much stronger. Now they are facing a candidate with more experience, deeper ties to the state, a better understanding of working-class voters, and a much greater ability to unify Democrats. He does not seem to inspire the same kind of hostility. People appear to like him. He does not carry nearly the same personal baggage, and Republicans can no longer rely on scandal to do all the campaigning for them. That is what makes this so perfect. Susan Collins and the Republican Party tried to turn the entire race into a referendum on one Democrat's personal misconduct. But in doing so, they removed the opponent they wanted to face and replaced him with the opponent they should have feared. The scandal they thought would rescue Trump and Collins may ultimately be the scandal that destroys them.